Hello and the warmest of welcomes to this new episode of Rambling Reviews. I'm your humble host Miles Mason, and in this week's episode we're taking a look at the rootsy record Highway 61 Revisited by none other than the freewheeling Bob Dylan. Now this is one of my favourite projects of all time, just a fantastic body of work. So without further ado, let's get straight into the review. Robert Allen Zimmerman, or as he's more commonly referred, Bob Dylan is one of the all-time quintessential American singer-songwriters. Born out of Hibbing, Minnesota, as a young lad, he developed a real passion for the music he heard on his old transistor radio, falling in love with the sounds of rhythm and blues and rock and roll artists like Elvis Presley and, of course, Little Richard. The Bob Dylan we now know and love, however, wasn't born until he moved away to college. That's where he found himself infatuated in writers, poets, and in the genre of music that would go on to define his career: American folk music. In particular with the legendary singer-songwriter Woody Guthrie, whose rootsy rasps and melancholic melodies really resonated with a young Robert. Woody's influence would become a massive source of sincere inspiration for Bob's first three albums, particularly so on his 1962 self-titled album that features the incredibly sweet tribute track, A Song to Woody. And I just want you guys to take a really quick listen to this song by Woody. It's called A Hobo's Lullaby. Such a sweet name, I know. But I just think it really demonstrates where a lot of Bob's early sound came from, which I think is really important when it comes to appreciating an artist. Just take a listen.
I know the police cause you trouble.
Fire,
They
right?
cause trouble everywhere. But when you
To me, it's super reminiscent of songs. Like "Don't Think Twice, It's Alright" from Bob Dylan's breakout album Freewheeling Bob Dylan. I just think it's really, really fascinating to look into where a lot of artists' inspiration came from, because it tells you a lot about their story. So it goes to say that on these early projects, they were just so incredibly rooted in the sound that had inspired his journey thus far. But by 1965, he decided to continue the blues rock and roll band styles he'd been experimenting with on his previous album, bringing it all back home. A real milestone project for Bob Dylan's discography, and an album that would lead him to write this masterpiece of folk rock perfection, Highway 61 Revisited. So, with this album, Bob Dylan brought together all the characteristics that had helped define his music so far, including his rootsy writing and recording style, as well as his vivid storytelling. However, with this new album, he wanted to bring a more energetic, bustling blues brightness. To help him accomplish this, he brought in a bunch of brilliant musicians to the studio, namely Bobby Gregg on drums, Joe Macho Jr. on bass, Paul Griffin on piano, as well as Frank Owens and Michael Blumenfeld on rhythm and lead guitar, respectively. Armed with this band, Bob boldly brought together some of the most raw songs of all time, with a massively blues-inspired feel. We're talking epics like It Takes a Lot to Laugh, It Takes a Train to Cry, and my personal favourite, A Tombstone Blues. A fantastically aggressive folk number that perfectly embodies the sound of this album, but with its double-time drums alongside its driving bass and guitar, making for a massively different sound, particularly considering the styles of his more iconic hits like Blowing in the Wind, for example. I mean, these two songs couldn't be further apart, and this is something that rubbed a lot of his folk fans up the wrong way, as they expected more romanticised ballads, but this album was anything but. I think to get to the root of the inspiration behind this album, we must first look at where Bob was in his life, as by this time he was one of the most well-established musicians around, whose sound had helped define a generation, a sound that really spoke to so many people. But I don't think this was truly making him satisfied at the time, as he wanted to be able to continue pushing the envelope and continue to grow as an artist. In fact, he became so dissatisfied with his own songwriting material that he was quoted as saying, "I was going to quit singing, I was just so very drained, and that it's very tiring having other people tell you how much they dig you if you don't dig you." And I know this is pretty deep, but I just think it helps demonstrate where his mind was at the time: uninspired and tired. That was until, of course, he came up with Like a Rolling Stone, the song that would help wash away his songwriting stagnation. And I just find this to be such a beautiful thing in songwriting, that this brilliant song brought back his fire and gave the world one of the most widely loved songs of all time. I mean, this is a song of particular importance to me, and it's one that made a real impact on me when I was younger. And that is a real gift, I feel. I mean, I wish I could play this song for you guys, but I don't want this video to get taken down for the second time. But it will be a part of this week's further listening list on my Spotify playlist, linked down in the description box. Now, for the composition of this priceless project, it naturally saw some of the most diverse production styles of Bob's work to date. Thanks to the relatively fresh-faced producer Bob Johnston, who would go on to produce for Simon and Garfunkel and Leonard Cohen, Johnston would record every song of this album in about 4 days, besides Rolling Stone, which was produced prior to this album by Dylan's long-term producer Tom Wilson. Now, Highway 61, being his first fully band-oriented album, would aim to hone in on the synergy of the band and how they worked together, focusing on getting a real hard-hitting and fast-paced live tone that, in my opinion, was super significant for the sound of this album, as it helped contribute to the concept of this project, which was, in essence, to be about fusing the modern sounds and production of rock and roll music with the authentic rawness of blues and folk music. Now, this sonic fusion, as I said, rubbed a few fans the wrong way at the time, but in the grand scheme of things, this would prove to be a real honest reflection of the music Bob wanted to make at that time, and an important artistic expression, an expression that would go on to define the sounds of folk rock music, a widely celebrated subgenre that has inspired a myriad of artists, such as Neutral Milk Hotel, for example. I think it's really important to recognise this album's influence, as above the instrumentation and the composition, the lyrics still contain the protest of his previous projects, just from a different, more grounded perspective. Most importantly for me, I feel this movement to more rootsy, raw rock music demonstrated Bob Dylan's reverence for a sound that was getting lost in the progression of super clean mainstream pop rock, paying his respect and reminding the audiences to revisit where it all began. So as I just mentioned, this album would prove to be one of not only Bob Dylan's most influential bodies of work, but a standout album in the history of music that saw personal risk prevail, producing a piece of art that will live on forever. In fact, this album would go on to be ranked the 4th greatest album of all time by Rolling Stone magazine, a spot that I can honestly say it deserves, thanks to how much this music would mean to people and how much it has continued and will continue to inspire across the generations of music lovers. Bob Dylan, without a doubt, is one of the biggest icons in music. His songwriting just has so much character to it, from the weird and at times perplexing lyrics to the authenticity that came from his honest and open storytelling. One of the most important things for me about Highway 61 is that it helped reinvigorate Bob's musical legacy, freeing him up creatively to make many more classic albums like Blonde on Blonde and John Wesley Harding, albums that, rest assured, I'll be getting to soon enough. All in all, I feel that for Bob, music was just such a vital tool of expression, and I feel that's part of what we're all here to do. Express ourselves in every way we can. Okay, so that almost does it for this week's episode of Rambling Reviews, but first, before I bounce, I must say I had an absolute blast talking about this album. It's such a classic, and it was a real pleasure today to discuss it with you guys. But now I would love to know what you have to say about this album, so why don't you type a few lines down in the comment section below and tell me what this album means to you. And if you are interested, I've put together a little further listening playlist on Spotify for this week's episode, basically a collection of songs that help establish the story of this storied album. So thank you ever so much for tuning into this week's episode of Rambling Reviews. It means more than you know. And if you enjoyed this week's episode, don't forget to subscribe for more classic album reviews. And actually, check out my Instagram, linked in the description. I've been posting tons of musically related content over there. So thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next episode.